In this video, we're going to revisit the lemonade stand data. If you recall from the previous video, what we did is we calculated the total revenue and total profit associated with selling apple juice and lemonade across 3 different people. We answered these 6 questions and we did so using formulas. However, today what we're going to do is answer these same 6 questions just using pivot tables instead. To create a pivot table, what I'm going to do is select my data. And I'm going to do that by clicking and dragging my mouse across the extent of the data. With my selection, I'm going to go to Insert on the ribbon and then click on Pivot Table. I'll get a pop-up that appears. Here, there are 2 critical fields that are important. The first one is the table or range of data that I want to create a pivot table from. We always want to create a pivot table from some raw data, not a summary of the data. We do have these summaries over here, Q1, Q2. We have the revenue associated with apple juice. That would be a summary that is collapsing essentially what is 26 rows of data into 2 rows or 1 row. But here, I don't want a summary. I want to create from the raw data itself. So I'm just confirming that the data, I've got the appropriate data selected here. The second thing that we need is to decide where to put it, somewhere new or somewhere that already exists. I'm going to click on New Worksheet. When I click OK, what will happen is a new worksheet will be created in the bottom. Sheet 2. I'll rename the sheet to be Pivot Tables. I have a pivot table here, and right now there's nothing in it. And you can see it says Pivot Table 1. This refers to the name of the pivot table. Now, if you're like me and you already forget what the 6 questions are that we're working towards, what you can do is go back to the original data, and I'm going to copy and paste these 6 questions. So let's use this first pivot table to calculate how much revenue did apple juice and lemonade generate and how many units were sold for each of apple juice and lemonade. So maybe it's appropriate for me to rename this pivot table. There are multiple ways in which I can do that. The easiest way is by selecting the pivot table. When you select the pivot table, you have 2 new tabs that appear on the ribbon, Pivot Table Analyze and Design. If I click out, those 2 tabs disappear, but if I click back, here they are again. I'm going to click on Pivot Table Analyze, go to the name field in the top left, and here maybe I'll write Q1, Q2, because we're going to use this pivot table to answer these 2 questions. Now, looking at the original data, and if we look at the summary we prepared when we answered this with formulas, Q1, notice, apple juice and lemonade, the revenue, is here and here. But the product, apple juice and lemonade, they're contained in different rows in our summary of it. We're going to replicate this structure exactly. The product is in different rows. So I'm going to go back to my pivot table. And I'm going to take the fields that exist in the underlying data, and I'm going to take the product field and drag it into the rows area. I'm also going to take revenue and put that into my values area, as well as quantity sold. And for good measure, while I'm at it, I'll do profit per transaction. So here we have a summary very quickly of revenue, quantity sold, and profit. But there's a few modifications we can make to this pivot table that will make it much more presentable moving forward. The first modification I'm going to make is get rid or apply custom names to each of these field names. The default name or the convention will always be sum of and then the field that's within it. I don't really like that, and we could change the operation just by going to the value field settings in the bottom right. If I wanted the count or the average or whatever, I can do that here. But I want to ultimately right now make this much more presentable. Instead of displaying sum of quantity sold and sum of profit per transaction, what I want to be doing is just displaying what the field is, have it be a more appropriate label. There are 2 ways in which I can do that. I can double click on this field right here, and I get a shortcut for the value field settings. So this is the quick way to go into the value field settings. The long way is to go into the value field settings in the bottom right in the field pane. If I click on sum of revenue, I go to field settings. This top one here is the name. Now what I'm going to do here is intentionally introduce an error. I just want it to have my custom name be revenue. But notice that's the source name of the field, revenue. This revenue, the source, it's coming from column F. But I want it to display as revenue. If I click OK right now, I'll get an error because I'm saying this custom name is going to be identical to the source name. So it won't work. But what I can do is trick Excel by just inserting a space next to it to give it or make it be unique. Alternatively, what I could do is just say revenue and it's measured in dollars if that is your preferred way of going about it. Next up is quantity sold. I'll give this a custom field name, double click, quantity sold, and here I'll say units. These are the units that are sold. And lastly, sum of profit per transaction. If you want to apply a custom field name, I have been going into the value field settings, or you can just type over it and say profit. So this is already a lot more presentable. So how much revenue did Apple Juice and Lemonade generate? We can see 33.75 and 22, which matches the 55.75 that we were expecting to see from our summary in the previous video. How many units were sold? 49 in total, 27 and 22. And that's Q1 and Q2. We can also get profit, which I guess was Q5. So this pivot table is covering Q5 as well. But before we move on and answer any of the other questions, what I'm going to do is apply more formatting to this pivot table. I'm going to go into the Design tab and apply a pivot table style. These are shortcuts that improve the presentation very quickly. Additionally, what I'll do is I'll change the report layout. Right now, the header for column A is row label, but perhaps I want that to be displayed as product. I can go to my report layout and show that in outline form. So there we have it. This is Q1, Q2, and Q5. Let's duplicate this procedure in order to answer Q3, Q4, and Q6. I'm going to do this in two different ways. First, I'll do it the long way by going to the underlying data, selecting it, insert pivot table. This time, however, I don't want it to be in a new worksheet. I'm actually going to position this somewhere that is close to the pivot table I'd already created. So I'm going to put it somewhere that already exists. What I need to do now is navigate to where I want to put it. So I'm going to put it right beside my other pivot table. Select the cell I want and click OK. So now here it is. These questions are kind of in the way, so let me move them a little bit. So this one will be revenue, units, profit by person. So maybe I give this a more descriptive name. Maybe this time I say performance by person. Let's move forward. Looking at our summary, when we entered Q3 and Q4, we have person in different rows. So in answering this question or developing a pivot table for it, I'm going to take the person and put it in different rows. The procedures now will be the same as the first pivot table. I'm going to take revenue, oops, I didn't mean selling price. I'm going to take revenue, quantity sold, and profit per transaction. And much like I did before, I'm going to apply a custom field name to these. Revenue, quantity, measured in units, and profit. Now, this was a lot of work. There's one more thing. I'll match the formatting of the previous pivot table. So I'll go to design. I'll apply the same style as well as the same report layout. Now that was a lot of work. If you're like me and you might be a little bit lazy and you want a quicker way to do it, what you can actually do is go to the original pivot table that you had created. I essentially want this exact pivot table. I just don't want the product. I want the person listed in different rows. So you can select the entire pivot table, click and drag with your mouse. Alternatively, if you click anywhere within the pivot table and hit Control A on your keyboard, it will select the extent of the pivot table for you. Now what I can do is Control C, copy, and Control V, paste my pivot table elsewhere. This pivot table will not have a name. It will be default pivot table 3 because it's the third pivot table we've created. So I could call this one, what was it, Q3, Q4, Q6. Now what I can do is simply remove the product from my rows area, click and drag out, and replace that with the person. This way, I created the pivot table very quickly, and I didn't have to reapply any of the formatting. It duplicated the formatting that existed within my original pivot table. There we have it. This is all 6 questions, but let's build on this. This pivot table here, the original one, pivot table 1, that we named Q1, Q2, is still copied to my clipboard. I know because there's an animated border across it. So let me paste it down below. I've duplicated it again. Now, perhaps what I want to do is actually have a pivot table that can answer all 6 questions, one single pivot table. To do that, all I really need to do with this pivot table is nest person beneath product. Now, I've essentially added another dimension into my pivot table. I have the summary by product, but I can expand to see by person as well. Or I could change the level by putting the person at the very top. Now, when I do this, there are some additional, when you nest fields within a pivot table rows or columns area, there are additional modifications that we can make. What you see in this gray highlight here is the total, the subtotal by product. Simply the baby, the dad, and the mom added together. If I want this displayed not at the top, at the bottom, I would have to go to Design, Subtotals, Show Subtotals at the bottom. Do not show subtotals, or show them at the top, which is the default. We could also insert blank rows if we really wanted to further separate it out. But this is pretty good. An alternative way of doing this would be not having a nested row or nested field within the rows area, but instead applying a filter. So now I can see the total. This appears as if it's a duplicate of the original pivot table, but we have the added feature of applying a filter to it, so we can see just the revenue for apple juice associated with baby, or dad, or mom. But I'm going to put the person back into the rows area, and I'm going to put the product in my filters area. This pivot table on the left appears as though it's an exact duplicate of the pivot table on the right. I have a filter applied to it, meaning that right now it's showing me both products, apple juice and lemonade, but I have the choice of filtering it to show me the revenue, quantity, and profit associated only with one of those two products. Another way to filter a pivot table would be by clicking in the pivot table. And to do this, I'm going to illustrate by doing it on the pivot table near the bottom right. I'm going to click in this pivot table on the bottom right and go to Insert in what is called a slicer. This slicer will detect the fields that exist in this pivot table all of the fields that are in the underlying data, and I'm going to take product and click OK. The products are the slicers are an alternative way of applying filters to the data. Filters are objects, and we can apply styles to filters really quite quickly. We have a new tab that appears on the ribbon when the slicer is selected. I'm going to just do a style that matches the original one, or the pivot table. And now I can filter this pivot table for either product. So it's showing me lemonade. An alternative way would be the filter directly within the pivot table. Lemonade. These two pivot tables are equivalent. It's just a different way of filtering. So there we have it, a quick and dirty introduction to pivot tables.